This is a video overviewing Economics Chapter 2. Chapter 2 talks about trade-offs, comparative advantage, and the market system. Our learning objectives for this chapter are to understand the productions, possibilities, frontier, and opportunity costs, comparative advantage and trade, and overview the market system. So in your chapter, as you read, managers are making choices at BMW. To compete in the automobile market, the managers at BMW must make strategic decisions, such as whether or not to introduce new car models, where in the world to advertise, and whether to concentrate production in Germany factories or to build new factories overseas, and which quantities of what model to produce. An inside look on page 60 discusses the trade-off GM's faced when deciding how to allocate resources between producing powertrains for its two electric vehicles, the Chevy Volt and the Cadillac Converge. So, when you buy a car, you probably consider factors such as safety and fuel efficiency. To increase the fuel efficiency, automobile manufacturers make cars smaller and lighter because large cars absorb more of the impact in an accident than small cars do. People are usually safer driving large cars. See if you can answer the questions by the end of this chapter. What can we conclude about these facts about the relationship between safety and fuel efficiency? And understand what characteristics would it be possible for an automobile manufacturer to make cars safer and more fuel efficient? Remember scarcity. It is the situation in which unlimited wants exceed limited resources available to fill those wants. Scarcity requires trade-offs. Goods and services and economic resources used to make them, which are factors of production, workers, capital, natural resources, and entrepreneurial ability, are scarce. This requires trade-offs. When we're overviewing a production possibilities frontier, a little tongue-tied, PPF, this is going to be a curve that analyzes the opportunity costs and trade-offs. It's a curve showing the maximal attainable combination of two products that may be produced with the available resources and current technology. Okay, so over here we have BMW. They have a production choice in their Spartanburg plant of hybrids or SUVs. At choice A, they can produce a quantity of 800 hybrids and 0 SUVs. Right here. At B, they can produce 600 hybrids and 200 SUVs. This is a combination. This is the maximum obtainable combination given the current resources and technology. At C, they can produce 400 and 400. At D, they can produce 600 SUVs and 200 hybrids, and at E, 800 SUVs. This is a 1-to-1 ratio here. So, point F is a combination that would be considered inefficient for the production possibilities frontier. That is because it's inside the line. So anything that is inside the line, this way, to the left of the line, would be considered inefficient. G actually is unattainable given the current resources. You cannot produce more cars than you can with the maximum obtainable resources and technology. So the opportunity cost is the alternative, the highest value alternative that must be given up to engage in an activity. Therefore, in order to produce 200 SUVs, they must give up 200 hybrids. Drawing a production possibilities frontier for Rosie's Boston Bakery. Rosie has 5 hours per day to devote to baking. In 1 hour, she can prepare 2 pies or 1 cake. So this is not a 1-to-1 ratio. So they have A, 5 cakes, 0 pies. B, 4 cakes, 1 pie. C, 3 cakes, 2 pies. D, 2 cakes, 3 pies. E, 1 cake, 4 pies. And F, 0 cakes, and 5 pies. That's the number of hours she's producing. This is the quantity that she made. Remember, she can produce 2 pies for every 1 cake in an hour. So this would be the possibility frontier that we would choose. If Rosie is at choice D, What is the opportunity cost of making more pies? In order to make more pies, she must give up cakes. She can make 2 more pies if she gives up 1 cake. This trade-off happens in all types of places, including healthcare. Facing trade-offs in healthcare spending. Although the consequences of being uninsured can be severe, particularly if someone develops a serious illness, economists are not surprised that at higher prices for health insurance leads to less health insurance being purchased. Faced with limited incomes, people have to make choices amongst the goods and services they buy. In a world of scarcity and trade-off, some kinds are inevitable. So this is an interesting question given the fact that we are all required now by the federal government to purchase health care, but is the required penalty enough to make people buy the health insurance, or is the fact that the health insurance costs so much more going to drive people to still continue to pay a penalty instead of buy health insurance? So this is a production possibility frontier about producing tanks and automobiles. At point A, they can produce 400 tanks and 0 automobiles. At point B, they only reduce tanks by 50, but they gain 200 automobiles. At point C, they increase automobiles by 200, but they decrease tanks by 200 in order to get to point C. The more resources already devoted to an activity, the smaller the payoff to devoting additional resources to that activity. So, if we talk about economic growth, this would be a reason that the production possibilities frontiers could shift. And so economic growth would show the same curve shifting from here to point B. So with the same amount of economic growth, we have the ability to produce more. Sorry. And then we can move from point A to point B. Point B shows a technology change. It wouldn't be an even shift. We could produce more automobiles, but not necessarily more tanks because of a technology change that affected the automobile production. So if you're understanding comparative advantage, and explain how it is the basis for trade. This is an example that is used from your book. It talks about the specialization and gains from trade. You have you and your neighbor. Your neighbor is better at picking apples and cherries. So your neighbor has absolute advantage in both. But that does not mean that they have comparative advantage. So if you were to pick apples the entire time that you had available, you could pick 20 pounds of apples and 0 cherries. But your neighbor could pick 30 pounds. If you were to devote your time to picking cherries, you could pick 20 pounds of cherries, and your neighbor could pick 60 pounds of cherries at the same time. Your neighbor is just faster. So what would happen? This is your PPF, Productions Possibility Frontier, and this is your neighbor's PPF. So do you think that your neighbor should just pick apples and a combination of apples and cherries and leave you out on your own? Trade is the act of buying and selling. So your consumption without trade, the maximum production of combination would be 8 pounds of apples and 12 pounds of cherries. But you could actually get to point B, something outside your production possibility frontier, if your neighbor picks and specializes. So if you don't trade, you're at point A. When your neighbor doesn't trade, they're at point C. If you specialize in picking apples, you can pick 20 pounds. If your neighbor specializes in picking cherries, she can pick 60 pounds. If you trade 10 pounds of apples for 15 pounds of your neighbor's cherries, you will get 10 pounds of apples and 15 pounds of cherries. That's more than you could produce on your own. And your neighbor could now get 10 pounds of apples and 45 pounds of cherries, more than your neighbor could produce on your own. Thus, you are both better off as a result of trade. Absolute advantage is the ability of an individual firm or country to produce more of a good or service than competitors by using the same amount of resources. Your neighbor has absolute advantage in picking both apples and cherries. But comparative advantage is the individual firm or country to produce a good at lower opportunity cost than their competitors. The cost of picking 1 pound of apples for you is 1 pound of cherries, but for your neighbor, it's 2 pounds of cherries. So the opportunity cost of picking a pound of cherries for you, you would lose 1 pound of apples, but your neighbor would only lose half a pound of apples. Therefore, having a comparative advantage in cherries and you having a comparative advantage in apples. The basis for trade is comparative advantage, not absolute. Just because you're better at something doesn't mean that you wouldn't benefit from specializing and then trading with a person or a firm. Individuals, firms, and countries are better off if they specialize in producing a good or service. I think of this in relation to me. If I were to dye my own hair, potentially, I may not be very good at it, so I'm not going to be fast. But I'm really fast at doing taxes. So if I were to trade with a friend of mine, it would be much better for me to spend my time doing taxes because I could produce a lot more than if I were to try to spend my time doing hair. This is another example. I'm going to skip this example. If you want to read it, you can read it. It again shows the same idea of trading honey and maple syrup. A market is a group of buyers and sellers of a good or service and the institution or arrangement which they come together to trade. Remember, we talked about this in Chapter 1. Now, there's different types of markets. There's a product market, a market for goods such as computers or services such as medical treatment. The factor market is a market for factors of production such as labor, capital resources, and entrepreneurial ability. Factors of production are the inputs needed to make goods and services. Factors of production are divided into 4 broad categories. Labor. This includes all type of work, from part-time labor of teenagers working at McDonald's to senior managers at large corporations. Capital refers to physical capital, such as computers, machines, tools that are used to produce other goods. And the natural resource, which is water, oil, iron ore, or other raw materials that are considered, quote-unquote, a gift of nature, that are used in production. And then entrepreneurial ability. An entrepreneur is someone who operates a business, and entrepreneurial ability is the ability to bring together other factors of production to successfully produce and sell goods and services. 95% of small businesses fail in the first 5 years, so this is special if you have entrepreneurial ability and are able to maintain this. When we talk about the circular flow of income, there are 2 key groups of participants in markets. A household that consists of all individuals in a home, and firms, which are suppliers of goods and services. This model shows how participants are linked to the market. We have households and firms, we have factor markets and product markets. Households go to work for the factor markets, and they provide labor, capital, natural resources to firms which produce a product or a service, and they provide that from households. Green is the flow of money. The product market spends money on goods and services from the firms are passed on as wages, and then households use that money to buy products. As you can see, if any one of these items stops, we have a problem with the flow of money and labor in the marketplace. A free market is a market with few government restrictions on how a good or service can be produced or sold, or how a factor of production can be employed. Countries that come closest to the free market benchmark have been more successful than those with centrally planned economies in providing their people with rising livings of standard, as Adam Smith argued in 1776. The market mechanism. The individuals usually act in rational, self-interested ways. In analyzing people in the act of buying or selling, the motivation of financial reward usually provides the best explanation for the actions taken by people. For market mechanisms to work in responding to changes in consumers' wants, prices must be flexible. In the famous words of Adam Smith, the firms would be led by quote-unquote the invisible hand, and the market to provide consumers with what they want. I'm going to show a brief clip of the invisible hand.
"60-second adventures in economics. Number 1, the invisible hand. An economy is a tricky thing to control, and governments are always trying to figure out how to do it. Back in 1776, economist Adam Smith shocked everyone by saying that what governments should actually do is just leave people alone to buy and sell freely among themselves. He suggested that if they just leave self-interested traders to compete with one another, markets are guided to positive outcomes as if by an invisible hand. If someone charges less than you, customers will buy from them instead, so you have to lower the price or offer something better. Whenever enough people demand something, they will be supplied by the market, like spoilt children, only in this case everyone's happy." Later free marketeers, like Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek, argued that this hands-off approach actually works better than any kind of central plan. But the problem is economies can take a long time to reach their equilibrium, and may even stall along the way. And in the meantime, people can get a little frustrated, which is why governments usually end up taking things into their own more visible hands instead.
So this explains the idea of the invisible hand and what Adam Smith meant by the invisible hand. A little quick clip. Firms respond individually to changes in relative prices by making decisions that collectively end up satisfying the customer's wants. The story of a market system in action. How do you make an iPad? The invisible hand of the market has led these firms to contribute their knowledge and resource to the process that ultimately results in the iPad available for sale in the United States. So these are all the components of the iPad. South Korea, United States, Germany, South Korea, Great Britain. So these people all produce different parts of the iPad. An entrepreneur is someone who operates a business to bring together factors of production, labor, capital, and natural resources to produce a good or service. Important products introduced by entrepreneurs in small forms. Here's the inventor and the product: the air conditioner, airplane, biomagnetic imaging, DNA fingerprinting, integrated circuit optical scanner, oral contraceptives, overnight delivery service, quick frozen foods, personal computer, a zipper. So I'm sure there's many more, but this is just a general idea. The legal basis of the market system is very important in order to understand, because if there were no legal basis for the market system, then entrepreneurs wouldn't have any incentive to produce. Property rights are the rights of individuals or firms to have exclusive use of their property, including the right to buy or sell. Patent and copyrights protect individual intellectual property rights for inventors and ideas of new products or production methods, and for creators of books, firms, and software. In order to be able to produce if property rights aren't enforced, then fewer goods and services will be produced. This reduces economic efficiency, leaving the economy inside its production possibility frontier. Think about if, how I think about the music industry and how it's very difficult now to enforce downloading of music, and people have been prosecuted for illegally downloading the music, but it's so available all over the internet that they went to different ways. So now, if you're going to be a singer, you make money on tour, you make money with products, endorsements, things like that, but not specifically on the music. Back to the economics of your life. At the beginning of the chapter, we asked you two questions. When buying a car, what is the relationship between safety and fuel efficiency? And understand in what circumstances would it be possible for manufacturers to make cars safer and more fuel efficient? You have to recognize that there is a trade-off between safety and fuel efficiency. And it very much looks like the relationship in the figure on 2-1. to make a point like G in 2-1 attainable, the automobile makers would have to discover a new technology that would allow the cars to be lighter and safer at the same time in order to make it possible for manufacturers to make cars safer and more fuel efficient. And that is all for Chapter 2.